Turns out the one thing that I spent a great deal of my early career as a composer trying to avoid is something that great composers do all the time. Today we're going to talk about what that is, why that is, and how we can start to incorporate it into our own music. When I was trying to get accepted as a private composition student of Luigi Zanninelli, I had to send him a few of the things that I had written on my own. I was a pianist and organist, so I had written just some fairly simple pieces for piano and organ. I think there were some pretty decent ideas in there, but they were definitely rough around the edges and kind of thrown together very unfocused. But they represented the best that I could do at the time with the knowledge that I had and experience that I had, or lack thereof. Well, I did get to study with Zanninelli, fortunately, and it was one of the most incredible experiences of my life. And a couple years into studying with him, I looked back on those pieces with some sort of detestfully? Anyway, I looked back on those pieces with kind of a harsh judgment. And I asked him, why in the world did you decide to take me on as a student when this was the stuff that I had sent you? And his reply gets very much to the root of today's topic and has stuck with me ever since, because he said, "You weren't afraid to repeat yourself when you thought you had something worth repeating." Now, I didn't do it often, and I certainly could have done it better, and all of the stuff in between those sections was kind of a mess, but at least there was something that I felt convicted enough to simply repeat. And that is such a simple concept, and yet it's something that I hear composers struggle with all the time. People who send me in stuff, people that I've worked with. It is such a common struggle, and it's something that I've dealt with myself, in spite of the fact that I got lucky in those pieces that I sent to Zanninelli. By the way, if you want to see examples of this, as well as some of the other compositional concepts that I have found most helpful over the years, I have a free ebook down in the description below that will help you with that. So why are we all so terrified of simply repeating an idea or a theme or a section when that might be the most powerful device that we can use? To defy expectations, we first have to establish expectations. Speaking strictly for myself as a young, inexperienced composer, I wanted to be a serious composer, whatever that means. And I thought that what that meant was that I had to constantly be coming up with new, innovative material. All of these clever variations on the stuff that I had done before. Because I didn't want to be too predictable. That was the sign of a clear amateur. Being too predictable, going exactly where the audience or the listener thinks that you're going to go. I wanted to defy those expectations. And that led me to being extremely hesitant to commit to any of my ideas. I didn't want to fall into the pop music trap of just relying on the same 3 chords over and over, because what pop music does really well is it's incredibly focused and it has very strong hooks. But what you give up in pop music is development of those ideas. They never go anywhere. We just find different ways to repackage them with the production usually, or with new lyrical content, which is extra musical. So being the serious instrumental composer that I was, I went to the other extreme and I just never repeated anything most of the time. But somehow it was lost on me that all of the great piano repertoire that I had already been playing for over a decade at that point was full of repetitive motifs, ideas, themes, melodies, progressions, gestures. And once I started to realize that, I started to see how those composers would use repetition to establish expectations, because we can't defy expectations if we haven't established them in the first place. So my biggest issue was not arrangement or how to put the parts together, which is what I hear so much from composers who reach out to me. It was primarily in writing and developing ideas that were worth repeating, that begged to be developed, that could withstand being repeated. You know, things that the listener and I, the composer, actually wanted, looked forward to hearing again. And once you have one strong idea, you can start to mine it for more material. And that's how you write a piece of music that feels coherent, cohesive, and well-connected, well-crafted. It requires a little bit more time and understanding of a few concepts to write that initial idea, but then it makes the entire arrangement process so much easier because you aren't constantly trying to come up with new things and throw those random ideas at the board to see what sticks. There's a reason that ABA form is so powerful, and it's because the A section is so strong, we want to hear that section again. I remember another assignment that I was working on with Zananelli where I was writing hymn arrangements or hymn settings for choir and organ. Sacred music, I've been doing church music as an organist for almost 2 decades at this point. And I love taking these well-known hymn tunes and harmonizing them in new, interesting ways. That way I have the sort of constant of the hymn tune to keep things glued together, where I can also find these interesting, fresh harmonic changes underneath. And I remember I would write these in verses because they're hymns, they are done in verses. I would write the first verse and I would carefully craft this chord progression or these series of parts and harmonic changes underneath the melody. And then I would throw that away when it came time for the second verse and the third verse. And I would have to feel like I came up with something entirely new or innovative. I was deathly afraid to repeat that chord progression. And Zananelli, Mr. Z, as we affectionately called him as his students, he said, "Why would you do that? You already came up with the strongest possible option. It was a painstaking process to make sure that these chords were right underneath, and you've abandoned them. I want to hear those again." And you can find other ways to create variation. You can add a descant on top. Maybe you can pull a descant from some of those inner parts and revoice it so that it's the top voice now. And I've talked a lot about how to write chord progressions that are linear, so it feels like writing a series of independent melodies. And I've mentioned that in several other videos that you can go and check out on this channel. Also in the ebook, I talk about that as well. And so we have all of this other wealth of areas where we can develop a variation without having to throw everything away. In fact, we need some sort of repetition to keep things tied together. I don't have to throw the baby out with the bathwater, as he was also fond of saying. Every time that I came to a new verse, a lot of the framework was already there. If we go back to the classical period and take a look at an expanded version of this ABA form, sonata form, we can see this very much at play, where composers would take fragments of their themes from the A section, the exposition, and then they would develop them in the B section, appropriately called the development. So we, the listener, are constantly being exposed to strategic repetition of these ideas, whether in full form, when the A comes back at the end, in the recapitulation, or in this tiny fragmented form, where they're taking up all these chopped up pieces of those themes and creating sequences and motifs and gestures out of them in the development. But then, as I just touched on, the recapitulation is just a almost one-for-one repeat of the A section with some variations in there, but nothing major. Because sometimes the most powerful, honest thing you can do is simply repeat the very strong main idea that you came up with. And if you do choose to write a variation on that idea, don't change everything all at once. If you do that, it's going to defeat the purpose, because we're probably not even going to be able to recognize that it's a repetition of that idea anymore. Instead, just pick one thing to change. Maybe one chord change, one rhythmic motif, one melodic change, a very small thematic change. This way we get the impact of that repetition, the thing that we've already established. And we get the added benefit of it sounding like we are developing that established idea. We've set the expectation so that we can defy the expectation. So the next time you're trying to figure out how to change that melody or chord progression, ask yourself why you're doing that. Does it serve a purpose, or are you just doing it for the sake of changing it because you feel like you can't repeat it again the same way twice? Ask yourself, once you zoom out and get out of your own head and listen to it the next day, have my changes made it stronger or weaker? Sometimes the best decision is the easiest decision. Leave it alone. Just repeat yourself. And if you want to watch a video about how to write parts instead of just chord progressions, you can watch this video right here where I talk more about that, and that's going to make those parts more easy to develop in the ways that we've mentioned in this video.